guys, Olive here. Today I am here to do the very first episode of Russian History Retreat. Today, in the very first episode, over a glass of wine, we are going to be discussing Ivan the Terrible. You can of course correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel as though Ivan the Terrible is one of the more well-known czars. Of course, after Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Nicholas II. When people first think about the czars, I feel like people most frequently are thinking about the Romanov dynasty, whereas they are not so frequently aware that there was a whole dynasty of czars before that. These czars were known as the Rurik dynasty. The next to last Rurik czar was Ivan IV, or as we know him, Ivan the Terrible. His father, Vasily III, and his grandfather, Ivan III, both used the term Tsar, but in an unofficial capacity. They were never recognized as Tsar. Ivan IV and his predecessors were actually coronated Grand Prince of Moscow. This requires a little bit of background into Russian history, which I am going to simplify for time's sake. Very early on in Russian history, when Russia was still known as Rus, the Mongols invaded in 1223. The Mongols ruled over Russia in a somewhat unofficial capacity from 1240, when they officially conquered Russia, until the Russians finally shook off the Tatar yoke in 1480. The people who lived under the Tatar yoke were pretty free to live and worship as they desired, but there was a pretty hefty tribute demanded of them. The Mongols pretty much ruled by proxy. The tribute that they demanded was exacted from the princes of the different principalities of Rus at the time, which were usually centered around a major city. The principalities each had their own importance, but the most important principality was Moscow, Muscovy, which was a vassal state of the Mongol yoke. Therefore, the most important prince was the Grand Prince of Moscow. This title started with Daniel I in 1283 and ended with Ivan IV when he then started going by Tsar of all the Russias. Therefore, he was Tsar of all the principalities. Tsar, as you may or may not know, is a diminutive form of the term Caesar. I am pretty particular with the way that Tsar is pronounced. It should be T-S-A-R, not C-Z-A-R, mostly because the letter Ts most closely resembles the English letters T and S together. If you spell and or pronounce the word Tsar, C-Z-A-R, I don't think you know what you're talking about. Moving back to Ivan IV, he was born to Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily III. He ascended to the throne at the tender age of 3, with his mother acting as regent after his father passed away. However, his mother also passed away when he was only 8. At this point, and then at many occasions thereafter, there were, hypothetically, plots by the boyars, or the Russian aristocracy, and the other princes ruling the principalities within Rus to overthrow Ivan IV and place someone else in his place, with him being so young. Whether Ivan IV was actually being threatened at this time or not, the truth remains that he felt as though he were about to be overthrown and felt that way many times thereafter. This was a repeating occurrence. This fostered a sense of suspicion and paranoia that followed Ivan throughout his entire life. The first 15 or so years that Ivan was the main ruler are not what earned him the title Grozny, or terrible. In Russian, it translates more to formidable, awe-inspiring, or dreaded than it does to terrible, and it has strong connotations of majesty and mightiness. But slapping him with the terrible title is not the biggest crime there ever was. It actually ended up being quite a fitting moniker for him, given that his sociopathic tendencies started very young within Ivan. There are many tales of Ivan truly enjoying torturing animals, and we already know his propensity for paranoia. He really had no one good male role model to show him how to be a good man, let alone a good ruler, since his father died at such a young age. His mother died very shortly thereafter, and the boyars were more concerned about infighting than they were about how to show Ivan how to be a good leader. It was after the death of his first wife, Anastasia, who bore him 4 children, that the Grozny side of Ivan really started to come out. No one knows if it was the grief over the death of his first wife, if it was a mental breakdown, or if it was the influence of his second wife, which many claim to be cruel and sadistic herself. But Ivan started down a very dark path after Anastasia's death. He became, after she died, a drunken, debaucherous, and downright dangerous ruler. During this period, Ivan ordered the executions of his enemies, of anyone who spoke against him, of innocents, and even of his own family members. Everyone was at risk under his wrath, which is extremely reminiscent of Stalin. Repeated conspiracies amongst the boyars, the nobility, to remove him from the throne made him ever more suspicious, but the more suspicious and paranoid he got, the more likely the boyars were aiming to remove him from the throne, thus creating a never-ending circle. Ivan had brutal methods of torture and execution. There was one story that I'm afraid I will never forget of him forcing a whole family, children included, under the ice of a frozen river in order to exterminate them. Probably Ivan's most famous act of cruelty was his role in the death of his own son and heir. While Ivan IV had many wives, he only ended up having 3 sons, all of which he had with his first wife, Anastasia. The healthy, intelligent young man who would have become Ivan V was Ivan's eldest and favorite child. This young man took after his father in many ways and was very close to him. However, as we know, Ivan IV was very suspicious and paranoid even of those closest to him. Earlier on that fateful day, he had heard people surrounding him claim that the boyars had planned to replace him on the throne with his young, vibrant son. With this idea circling in his head, he encountered his daughter-in-law, who, at the time, he thought was dressed immodestly. His daughter-in-law was pregnant with his son Ivan's child, his first grandchild, hopefully the heir to the throne after his son. But because he had himself so in a tizzy about his son replacing him on the throne, he beat her so bad that she miscarried that same night. His son, obviously heartbroken and infuriated, confronted his father that night. The two got into a heated argument during which Ivan the Terrible lost control of himself and started beating his son with his cane. Anyone who got in between the two of them also was brutally struck by the cane. It wasn't until his son collapsed on the ground that Ivan realized what he had done. He cried out in anguish, "Wretch that I am, I have killed my son! I have killed my son!" It wasn't until his son's death that Ivan became truly repentant of his misdeeds. He drew up lists of names of those he had had executed. He sent these lists with money attached to them to monasteries to have the priests pray for the souls of those he had executed. The estimates of number of people that Ivan had executed range from anywhere between 3,100 and 3,800 people. Though this does not come even close to the number of people lost under Stalin, it is a very significant number considering the time period. And of course includes the most obvious and the most qualified heir to the throne, Ivan. Because Ivan was dead at the time that his father died, the throne went to Fyodor, his younger brother, who was very pious but not an intelligent individual. Therefore, Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible's legacy, not only includes the acquisition of Kazan and Astrakhan, but also unfortunately predicts the end of the Rurik dynasty, considering his son Fyodor was the last of them. After a prolonged illness and period of grief for his son's death, Ivan IV died in 1584, leaving the throne to his son Fyodor, who ended up having no children. So that was a very concise, very abbreviated history of Ivan the Terrible, or Ivan Grozny. The two sources that I read and consulted during this project were Ivan the Terrible by Isabel de Madariaga and Ivan the Terrible by Henry Troyat, translated from the French by Joan Pickman. Of these two, for a beginner, I would definitely recommend Henry Troyat's version, given that it is a lot more readable. It reads a lot more like a story. But if you are familiar with the very basic elements of Ivan's life, you definitely want to go with Isabelle de Madariaga's work. Both of these books were very illuminating. Of all the Russian History Retreat episodes I'm going to do this year, I consider myself a neophyte in this subject matter, so I am very grateful to have had both of these to consult. So if you have any comments about this subject matter in general, or have any specific reading recommendations for me based on this subject matter, I would love to hear it in the comment section below. You can also find me on a variety of places on social media, and the links to all those profiles are in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.